go to chapter 3. 1 John chapter 3. The last 2 weeks we've been in chapter 3, and admittedly there are some difficult, if I can use the word difficult, passages in chapter 3. Definitely passages that you need to compare with other scripture and put it in context to understand the message. But obviously the intention of chapter 3 was not to be difficult. I think the difficulty comes sometimes in our misconceptions. But I've spent the last couple of weeks, in a sense, I never really got to the point I wanted to get to as far as laying the foundation. So I don't want to review the chapter, but I do want to lay it back out. And so hopefully in the last couple of weeks, we've looked at a number of things, compared different passages. But I want to come to the final part of the chapter. And I think to understand the final part, I need to go back and just touch on this. But if you remember, without going back through every verse, the chapter begins, and if you look at verse 1, behold, what manner of love the Father hath bestowed upon us. So the emphasis on the Father's love. And it says the love is to the point that we should be called the sons of God. Well, therefore the world knoweth us not, because it knew him not. Now the world obviously knows us in the flesh. It knows us as far as our personal name. We may be neighbors with the unsaved world, but it means that we have no fellowship with them. We don't connect with them because they don't connect with God. The ones that don't know the Lord Jesus Christ just do not understand what makes us tick. So the emphasis here is that we are one day, because of what Jesus has done, we are going to be like him, for we shall see him as he is. So the chapter begins with this great promise that I am looking for a future change. I am not now what I will be on the outside. That is, this part that you see, the part that is in this world, is going to be changed, and I'm going to be completely like the Lord Jesus Christ. Now that hadn't happened yet. I still have to operate in this world, but it starts off with this emphasis that in the future we will be just like Jesus. That's the future change. Well, then it goes into this section where it uses terms like whosoever is born of God, in verse 9, doth not commit sin. He that committed sin is of the devil. And of course, these passages taken by themselves, you think to yourself, well, wait a minute. I consider myself to be born of God. I consider myself a Christian. I'm saved. And I sure wouldn't be so presumptuous as to say that I cannot sin. And if whoever sins is of the devil, well, I don't believe I'm on the devil's side. And, sometimes I fail. Well, I remind you again that the same epistle says in first chapter, if we say that we have not sinned, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us. God wouldn't have us say to ourselves, it's impossible for me to sin. In context, what he's saying here, he's already talked about the future change. He's talking about now the present change. Where did I change? I changed on the inside. He's talking about the two natures. See, I am one day going to be completely like Jesus. I'm not yet there. But there is a part of me that is already as saved as it ever will be. It's a part of me that is born of God. My soul is saved, and I'm just as much like Jesus on the inside as if I had never sinned. I'm justified. I'm righteous. And so the point here is not that I cannot commit an act of sin, but sin, if I can use it in a vernacular, doesn't stick to me because I'm saved. This old flesh will do wrong, and I'll reap for my sin just as much as anybody reaps for their sin. If I sin, my fellowship with God can be broken. If I sin, there are consequences in this life for my sin. The consequence, of course, is losing fellowship with God and reaping what I've sown. But as far as my position in God, I cannot transgress the law because Jesus bore the penalty of the law. So we have a future change. We have a present change. But then we go into the final part of the chapter, which talks about the practical change. Now, if I get that radically changed on the inside, isn't it clear that it's going to affect the outside? Even though I have two natures, I have the flesh that, of course, I deal with. I have the new man that lives inside. But that flesh is affected deeply by what's on the inside. Why does a lost man do what he does? Well, he does what he does because of what's in his heart. I mean, Jesus said it's not that which goes into a man, but that which goes out that defiles him. For inside, deep down in his heart, proceed adulteries and fornications and evil thoughts and covetousness and so forth. Well, you know what God did? Now, the flesh has an inherent fountain inside of it that's connected with the flesh that's bad. It came from Adam. I inherited this old body, and it has connected with it lust. But God changed the motivator in my heart and made it like Jesus. So it's bound to have an effect on the outside. Now, the emphasis that he makes here, it could be any number of sins that we could talk about. Certainly when I'm saved on the inside, my desires to do wrong and so forth will change. But what he says is going to be very evident. The clear thing that's going to change is what he began the chapter with. He says, behold, what manner of love the Father hath bestowed on us. Now, if the Father showed us love and saved us, you know what he saved me to do? To be like Jesus. Do you know what Jesus does? He loves. Now, we know that the first foremost attribute of God is holiness. He's holy. We know that we're going to be holy. We're going to be sinless. But on this earth, what is he going to do to radically transform me, but change me from a heart of selfishness, pride, and hate, and make me express love? So the Bible emphasizes in the book of 1 John this love. I want you to notice tonight, we'll narrow this down, start in verse 16, this final part of the chapter. And notice he says, hereby perceive we the love of God. How do we know God loved us? How do we perceive it? Well, it's very simple. Because he laid down his life for us. That's pretty evident. Well, now, if I can perceive that God loved me because he laid down his life, how will others perceive my love? That I'd lay down my life for the brethren. Now, I don't literally have to lay down my life to prove it, but the point is sacrifice. God was willing to sacrifice. Brethren are willing to sacrifice. So the first thing you've got here is an emphasis. What is the emphasis of love? It's sacrifice. Jesus defined it by dying on the cross. God so loved the world. But then I also think about this, and this is important to understand. He says that we'll lay down our lives for the brethren. Now, I'm sure that when a person is saved, it spills over into the world. In other words, Jesus looked on the multitudes, was moved with compassion on them. The world is not concerned about the world's spiritual well-being. I mean, that seems like it goes without saying. But you understand, a lost man doesn't look at a lost world and say, isn't it awful that they're going to hell? Because he's going to hell. The world doesn't look over at a jungle in South America to some of the natives with bones in their noses, and they're not civilized, and they just have old customs they've had for hundreds of years, and they'll go down and they'll do a documentary, and they'll see these people, and they live terrible lives, and they're just barely subsisting on what they have. They don't look at those people and say, those heathen are going to die lost. They just think, isn't it awful they don't have air conditioning? Isn't it terrible that they can't go down to the grocery store and buy groceries? And we might feel sorry for them in that. Now, that's sympathy. That's compassion that a human could have for another human. But what does a Christian do? He looks at a lost world and says, yeah, I'm sorry they don't have enough to eat. I'd be glad to help them, and I wish they could live a little better, but I wish they knew about Jesus. Man, I hate to see them die lost. That's forever. See, there is an essence, when God saves you, he puts in your heart, yes, a love for the world, just like he had a love for the world. We love the lost. But do you know even more so? He places an emphasis on our love for the brethren. And we're not talking about just, in fact, you can't really say a lost man is your brother. John Joe almost prayed for a lost man as his brother, and he thought, whoa, that's wrong. He's not. He's not your brother, because the lost world, they are of their father the devil, right? Now, I can have a physical brother that's related to me by blood, but spiritually, he becomes a brother when he's a Christian, when he's saved. Now, we ought to love the world, but God says that the love is going to be emphasized by our love for the brethren. 1 Timothy chapter 4, it talks about showing good and it says, especially to those who believe. In other words, yes, the lost world ought to be kind to them, ought to show some deference, and ought to be a nice person, but he says, especially to those that believe. Galatians chapter 6, I think it's verse 10, talks about doing good to all men, but especially those of the household of faith. See, we do have an obligation to the brethren, and you know what this is like. If you're saved tonight, if you know Christ, I just have to assume you've experienced what I've experienced. Now, part of it, I know it because it's in the Bible, but I know it by experience as well. When you get around somebody and you hear them talk, you recognize that they're a believer, you hear that they're saved. Now, they might even be, you might not even be the same stripe. But let's say you're in a group of people and there's 20 people there. Maybe some folks are drinking. Maybe some folks are telling dirty jokes. Maybe some folks are using bad language. Or maybe it's just one of those things where you sense, I don't fit in here. And then you meet another person and they say, boy, the Lord sure is good, isn't he? And you think, wonder if they could be saved. And you start talking a little bit about spiritual things and you recognize maybe they go to a church you don't. They're not right where you are. But you know, by talking to them, this person's born again. They know what it means. Don't you sense a connection with that person that you don't sense with anyone else? Now, let's say you were in a room with 15 people that took a different political position that you did. And you're in there and you're uncomfortable. They're all voting for a certain person that you wouldn't vote for. I'm not going to bring up any names tonight. I ain't going to cuss in the pulpit, but I'm going to bring up any names, okay? But they're all for that person, and you're just, man, I hope they don't ask me because I just don't want to bring it up. I'm not comfortable in here. I don't really like that guy. And then one other person, maybe under his breath, says, well, I'm not voting for him. I'm voting for so-and-so. Oh, this person's on my, okay, now I have a camaraderie. At least I know at least one person's with me. I can at least whisper to them what I'm for. But I don't have the same connection that I have with a born-again person. There's something different. When I find out a person is a Christian, there's something in my heart that says, and I don't think it this deeply, we're going to be in heaven together, but we really are. That's the point. There is a connection with a believer. He is a brother. We're kin to each other. We're blood kin. We know Christ. And that's what comes out from what God did on the inside. There's an emphasis. But then the emphasis is not enough. Secondly, he emphasizes that there is an expression of our love. Look down a little bit further. It says, but, in contrast, think about this. Whoso hath this world's good, and seeth his brother have need, and shutteth up his bowels of compassion from him, how dwelleth the love of God in him? My little children, let us not love in word, neither in tongue, but in deed and in truth. Now, that little phrase, bowels of compassion, God typically refers, in the New Testament, uses that word bowels, which is basically your insides. A lot of times we use the word heart, like I feel it in my heart, and God uses heart as well. But the bowels is the inner centralmost part of a person's being, and it's sort of a figurative expression, but it's inside. See, the love starts inside. So when I see my brother have a need, what really ought to stir me is, first of all, inward. In other words, inside, I feel compassion for my brother. Now, let me stop for a moment and put this in context. In the first century, this happened, and Paul mentions this in many of his epistles. You can see it play out. It happened in the book of Acts. You remember the disciples in the book of Acts had all things in common. Barnabas sold a piece of land, brought it to the apostles, and said, there's the money for it. Just spread it out to whoever needs it. I mean, they were that tight and that close-knit. Now, you say, well, why aren't we that spiritual today? We can't be that spiritual today because most folks aren't that spiritual. You know, if somebody brought in, hey, I just sold a piece of land, I just brought it in, y'all just distribute it any way you want to. I mean, we may not be wise enough to do that, but that demonstrates how much they loved each other. But why did they do it? In the first century, a person got saved, and automatically they were just cut off from the Jewish community. They were all Jews there in the first few chapters. No Jew was going to hire them. The family probably cut them off. They just didn't have a way to make a living. They were tremendous poor saints at Jerusalem, and you see references all through the New Testament about taking up offerings for them, trying to help the believers in Jerusalem, because nobody would look out for them. The Gentiles ended up having to. So the thought here is, you see your brother in need, how in the world, if God's really changed you, how could you not feel some compassion for that person? Now, I have people all the time give a call to the church. And obviously, if we're a church, we're responsible to pay their electric bill, they think. I mean, clearly, if we're a church, you must have a program to pay people's rent, right? I mean, sometimes they call and they're a little more deferring, and I just wanted to check and see. Others, yeah, I've just called in so-and-so, and I wanted to see what y'all have available to pay people's rent. Well, we don't really have anything available to pay people's rent. We got a form you can fill out, and it's called 1-800-WHO-CARES. No, I'm just kidding. No, it's not that. But no, we try to help people some. We do. We try to help the community. We take up others' offerings. But what is our others' offerings first and foremost for? The brethren. It's for the brethren. That doesn't mean we're uncaring. Doesn't mean that we don't help people. People that are around the office know some of these things that we face, and some of the people that we try to help just for testimony's sake. We don't want to be known as the church that, you call them up, they don't want to help anybody. We've taken offerings for people whose houses have burnt down. We don't know if they're saved or not. Just in the community, want to be a good testimony. I don't know if anybody has ever driven up and said, I need something to eat, and my kids are in the car and we don't have anything to eat. Several times I've taken them down somewhere, or I've sent Brother Arnie or Brother Swaffer or whoever, take them to the grocery store, buy them some groceries. You wish you could just give them some money and go, but you can't trust people with money. You don't know what they're going to buy. But yes, people are hungry. We help them. We do it out of compassion. But my point is, we bend over backward to help the brethren, the people that are saved. I mean, that's who our emphasis is for. Jesus said, the poor you have with you always. I mean, there's no question. There's always going to be some needs of people in the church. Sometimes it's people that didn't even ask for help. We've heard about a need, and we thought we could be a blessing to those people, and we try to help them. Other people have to come and say, look, I hate to bring it up, but I really have a need, and I don't know what you can do, and it's a blessing to be able to help them. It's not a burden to help them. It's a blessing to help them when they genuinely need help. Now, you're enabling people if they just constantly just looking for a handout, right? And I know somebody can claim to be saved and claim to be part of the church and demonstrate by their actions that they're just looking for what they can get and just trying to soak it in. So we have wisdom about those types of things. In the first century, it really was more clear. It was evident in the first century these people had a genuine need. So yes, I understand that immediately we can balk and we can think, well, you just can't start giving out money to every person who has his hand stuck out. And you're correct in that. You use wisdom. You ask God to help. And frankly, we have to make some hard decisions sometimes on those type of things. But when you find out a person has a genuine need, for instance, in the church, and we're aware of it, and we are able to go and say, look, we can help you with that. I mean, that is a great blessing. I mean, that's what the church is for, not just to pass out money, but the church is for our helping one another, to be a community. And that's what John is saying. It starts with a bowel of compassion. Now, I couldn't take time, we'll be out of time, to turn you over to the book of James, but James chapter 2 basically says the same thing. It says, if a person or brother or sister come to you and they're destitute of daily food, and you say to them, well, be ye warmed and filled. God bless you, brother. He said, don't just say it. He said, take something out and help them. If you have the ability, help them. The book of Proverbs talked about withhold not what you have when it's in the power of your hand to do it. God's given you the power to help, especially the brethren. Now, obviously, it'd be a fiasco if we thought that every single person in the world, I mean, you'd never make to where you're going in some places if you stopped and helped every homeless person that has his hand out. I forget who I was talking about the other day. We've both seen this happen. In fact, I think it got found out here in Charleston. There was about 9 of them, I think, all worked together and rotated around in all the different places, and they got caught. And they took up thousands of dollars. They had a little, panhandling ring. I've driven in tourist areas where they were expecting new people to come by all the time, but I happened to be there working in a church, and I'd come back and forth. I've seen them change shifts. I've seen them here. You take the sign, here you go, and here's my hat, and they go off, and the other guy took the sign and held it for a little while. I mean, yes, that's a fiasco. We don't just say, oh, well, you don't have any compassion. No, we can be as wise as a serpent, as harmless as a dove, but we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Don't become cynical. Don't become hardened. God sometimes will allow people to have a need just so we can meet it. I mean, he opens that door for us. So we have an expression of love outwardly with our actions. Then real quickly, there's an examination. Now this is important. In verse 19, he says, hereby we know that we are of the truth and shall assure our hearts before him. Now, how do we know? Well, hereby we know, I would take to mean, with the previous actions that we just described, our love, our compassion, the action that shows itself, we know that we have are of the truth. In other words, that tells me God's done something. It does tell me that God has done something in my heart when I feel compassion for people. Now, does my whole salvation rest on how I feel about other people? That would be a very subjective assurance. I mean, some days I'm in a better mood than I'm in the other days. So I might, well, today I don't feel all that compassionate, so maybe I'm not saved after all. The other day I feel very compassionate. Oh, no, the point is, hereby, the fact that this happened proves something. Look over to chapter 4 and verse 7. It said, beloved, let us love one another, for love is of God. Everyone that loveth is born of God and knoweth God. Now let that saying sink down in your heart. Everyone that loveth is born of God and knoweth God. Now that doesn't mean that a person can earn their new birth and knowledge of God by loving, but what it does tell me is if a man is not born again, he really doesn't have the capacity to agape love, like we talked about, the self-sacrificing. He can phileo, and you remember the terms we used, but to have agape love, this says that if he does, evidently he's born of God. That's strong. So if I love, what does that tell me? I'm of the truth, and I shall assure my heart. But it's subjective. So what about the day that I wake up and I say to myself, yeah, I have demonstrated love for people, but boy, I don't feel very loving today. I don't feel very compassionate today. So am I now not assured of my salvation at all? Well, look at the next verse. He says, for if our heart condemn us, well, sometimes it does, doesn't it? God is greater than our heart and knoweth all things. Beloved, if our heart condemn us not, then have we confidence toward God. You know, I've heard two different takes, and both of these are applications. They're the same interpretation, but two applications to this, and it really is true. What if a person thinks that he's saved and he's not? Now, why he thinks that may be because, well, I was raised in a Christian home, been in church all my life. I don't take drugs, never murdered anybody. I've read some of the Bible. I even put some money in the plate. What does the Bible say in Matthew 7? Many will say unto me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in thy name? And in thy name cast out devils and done many wonderful works? And then will I profess unto them, I never knew you. My heart didn't even condemn me. But God is greater than our heart. Your heart wasn't enough. God knows the truth. That's one application. Here's the guy thinks he's saved. Doesn't matter. God knows what your heart's really like. But then the other is also true. What about when I wake up and I don't feel saved? What about when I say, man, I hadn't been very compassionate? Or I'm struggling with sin and I'm thinking, man, did God really change me? Well, my heart may condemn me. Thank God my salvation doesn't depend on how I feel about it. God is greater than my heart and knows all things. But what happens when both of them work together? First of all, objectively, I know I'm saved because I put my trust in Jesus. That's how I know I'm saved. Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. That's how I know I'm saved. But then on the other hand, what about when I look at my life and I think, wow, God did do something. There is no reason that I ought to be compassionate like that, and God did something in my heart. at the same time I know I'm saved, both of them come together, then have we confidence toward God. You know, there's nothing that'll make you more effective as a Christian in service than when you're confident you know that you're saved. And that's when that confidence comes. I've just about done because we're out of time, but remember the psalmist in Psalm 40. He said, I waited patiently for the Lord. He inclined unto me and heard my cry. Set me up also, took me out of a horrible pit, set my feet upon a rock, established my goings. Thou hast put a new song in my mouth. He recognized it. I've already established. I'm on the rock. That's been established. That's done. He knew he was already pulled out. But then he said, you've put a new song in my mouth, even praise unto my God. I'm not just going to enjoy it. He said, many will see it outward. See, the inward is established. Then the outward reminds you, wow, God did do something. You know, I don't have any problem pointing out my faults. I'm not surprised, really, when I do something bad. But what surprises me is that sometimes I will accomplish something productive. Then I have to look and say, that's got to be God. He must have done something. How in the world would I be able to produce that? God had to do it. And that gives us confidence. We're out of time, so we're going to stop there. Lord, we thank you for your word tonight.